Hello and welcome. I'm John Walsh, President and CEO of the Michigan Manufacturers Association. We greatly appreciate you joining us today for this webinar, what we hope to be the first in a series. Our goal is to share information with you that we think would be important to help manufacturing approach the issue of sustainability in a manner that's helpful to your business, helpful to your community, and helpful to our planet. I want to start by thanking all of our panelists that are joining us today and also acknowledging our partnership with the Nature Conservancy. It might seem odd that manufacturing and the Nature Conservancy would join up, but to be quite honest, the reality is we have many common goals. We want to take care of our planet, of our communities, and we want to be productive in the manufacturing industry. And that's why we partnered to bring what we think is good information and hopeful information for you to consider. For those of you that have questions, please know that there will be an opportunity at the end for the panelists to answer them. If you're joining remotely, please use the question and answer feature through Zoom. With that, I'd like to introduce Madhu Anderson, who is the Vice President of Government Relations for the Nature Conservancy, and she'll take it from here. Enjoy the seminar.
Thank you, John. We're really excited to kick off this collaboration with you and the Manufacturers Association. Hello, everyone, and good morning, and welcome to our official kickoff of this series and this partnership. Thank you for joining us today. At the Nature Conservancy, we anticipate that you as manufacturers will be asked, maybe even required, to build in more sustainable practices into your operations by policymakers. I know that this sounds like just one more problem at a time when you're faced with a lot of challenges, such as meeting higher manufacturing standards, meeting supply chain disruptions, finding skilled labor, and dealing with rising costs. But we'd like to show you that with the help of other businesses, that starting down this road earlier rather than later will help you keep globally competitive, save money, and become a more attractive place for millennials and Gen Zers to come work for you. And as John said, improve the quality of life in your communities. So our objective with this series is to help manufacturers take the lead and own their own path forward on sustainability. So for those of you hearing about the Nature Conservancy for the first time, let me give you just a short background. The Nature Conservancy is a global environmental organization, and we are dedicated to conserving the lands and waters on which all life depends. We are a science-based organization, and we look for innovative, on-the-ground solutions so that nature and people can thrive together. We work in all 50 states and over 70 countries. In Michigan, we have over 40,000 members. We've protected nearly 400,000 acres in the state, and currently we actively manage about 55,000 acres. Let's get started on our topic today. We know that industrial production is only expected to increase in the coming years, and much progress has been made on reducing industrial emissions, but we have a lot further to go, and there's some very unique challenges in the industrial sector. So what might work in one industry may not work in another. And so this really is calling for new technologies that I think many people are considering a new industrial revolution. So we have a gracious panel today that will be speaking with us about some of the strategies that they've looked at and some of the things to think about. Let me introduce them now. Rachel Jones is Vice President of Energy and Resources Policy at the National Association of Manufacturers. And Rachel will speak to us about why manufacturers of all sizes should start thinking now about sustainability. Mary Roten is Sustainability Director at Ford Motor Company, and she will discuss Ford's sustainability goals and how this affects suppliers moving forward. And hopefully will share with us some of Ford's challenges and advantages that they've gained from doing this work. Next, we'll hear from Susan Fancy, the Program Manager for Technology and Commercialization at the Global CO₂ Initiative, which is housed at the University of Michigan. Susan will discuss why we need a new approach to emissions and some of the opportunities that brings. And finally, all of you know Caroline, who is the Michigan Manufacturers Association's Director of Environmental and Regulatory Policy, and she'll give us some insights into what is on the horizon at the state and federal level. I'd like to note for you that two of our speakers, Rachel and Mary, will have to leave the webinar at 11:30. And so Caroline will take questions at that time for Rachel and Mary when they stop speaking, so that you have a chance to ask your questions before they go. Also, during this webinar, you'll see some poll questions that pop up occasionally. Please tell us some of the topics that you'd like to have discussed in future webinars, and we'll adjust that. We'll take that information and adjust our policies forward. So I hope you'll really enjoy this conversation. And Rachel, we'll get started with you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Madhu, and all of you for letting me get to have the pleasure of joining this conversation today. Rachel Jones, I'm with the National Association of Manufacturers. We very much treasure our partnership with Michigan manufacturers and have longstanding relationships with many members in Michigan, being the manufacturing stronghold that it is. So I'm honored to get to join you all here today. I'm just going to kind of talk through three, I think, high-level points that I think are critical for us to keep top of mind. And the first is obviously what Madhu said, which is that now really is the time and really an opportunity to be leading as manufacturers, regardless of your industrial sector or your size. Now really is the time. The second piece, excuse me, is a recognition that we are all in different places. Our sustainability journeys start in different places and take different routes, but that's okay, and that can be a strength. And then the third is just for all of us to remember to keep a balance of the three legs of the sustainability stool, both environment, economics, and then also the social side. So on each of those, and I'll be pretty brief here because I'm interested in your views, and I think Mary has an incredible story to share from Ford's perspective. But as we think about sort of the why, the now, exactly as Madhu said, there's a lot of other things that may be top of mind and are real challenges, but at the same time, we do know that there's a lot coming, whether it's ESG requirements out of the SEC, whether it is regulatory specific environmental justice issues happening at the state, national, local level, reporting, whether it's shareholder pressure or whether it's financing, that all gets folded in together. This is something that is moving forward very quickly. The train has left the station, and but we're at a time where you still can be a part of the leading edge, and that can be an opportunity from a business standpoint. The second area, though, is that recognition that we're in different places. At the NAM, we've done a number of different sustainability surveys to kind of understand better who is where and why, and what are the things that they're working on, what are the challenges. It's been interesting. Our first major one we did in 2019, and then we just released a second one about a week ago with our Manufacturing Leadership Council, and we're seeing progress. So in 2019, across all size manufacturers, we were looking at about 72% that had some sort of a sustainability program in place. By the one that we just released last week, that's up to 87% that are working on that and really view that as a foundational responsibility of the manufacturing sector and their businesses specifically. But what is also interesting when you kind of dig into the numbers a little bit deeper, that's where you see the real differentiation. So even going back to the 2019, 2 years ago, 95.7%, so almost 96% of large manufacturers did have a sustainability program, plan, reporting, et cetera, in place. But then when you looked at small manufacturers, we had 50% that did not have plans to work on anything. And so that 96% and 50% are obviously in wildly different places. And that was just 2 years ago. We have seen, some changes, but it still is a very different place. And that can be incredibly intimidating. That can be something that can make people say, well, why should I even do this? I'm so far behind. But I think with this meeting and series like this and working closely with Michigan manufacturers and people in your own backyards, there's a real opportunity for shared learnings here. And what I've seen in my role, and it's one of the most fun things, is that we represent really big companies, but we also represent lots of small and medium-sized manufacturers. And there's a real desire I see across the board for those who have, already spent the time and investment in working through sustainability plans on different types of medium to share those learnings. There's a real desire to, help those who maybe are at a different place in their journey or maybe haven't even started it yet, instead of having to totally reinvent the wheel, to get together and learn from each other and maybe accelerate down your sustainability journey even faster than some of the larger companies have been able to do because of that opportunity for shared learnings. So that part of it, I think, is really encouraging to me. Give you a really quick story that I think relates to this particular element. I had the opportunity to visit with one of my small members. He's a brick manufacturer. And like I said, a small member, but we're going to hear from Mary with Ford next, but they're older than Ford. And so they've been in the brick making business for a little over 200 years. And when I talked to him and kind of wanted to talk about sustainability, it's a family business. And he says, sorry, I don't have time for that sustainability mess. I'm worried about payroll, workforce, international competition. I have all these other issues that are top of mind first. And he paused for a minute and I said, well, let me try talking about this in a different way. Sustainability is about the energy you use, the water, the waste you produce, how you can do those things more efficiently. And he laughed. He said, well, of course, we've been doing that for 200 years. Why would we make bricks 200 miles from where they're going to be used if we have the ability to move some of those processes closer because of just the weight of the bricks and the way that they use water, or it's scarce in some of the places? And so it was really encouraging to him as a small manufacturer to realize, wait a second, this is something I'm already doing. How can I get metrics around what I'm doing? How can I be more efficient in doing this? And suddenly the idea of sustainability moved from something that academics talk about, moved from something that, advocacy organizations talk about, to something that was very much about his bottom line and something that he was comfortable with and had been doing for a long time. It was just about learning new languages and metrics to be able to essentially get credit for what they've been doing and then make even more progress. And so I think that's the element that makes the different starting places more approachable and can help us get past some of that initial intimidation. The third thing is just, I think it's important for all of us to really remember to balance the three legs of the sustainability stool. Often those legs are called environment, economics, and social. I like to think of them in a way that makes it easy for me. I think about the planet, profit, and people. And, for most of us focusing as environmental professionals and in this realm, it's very easy to remember to keep an eye and a real focus and North Star on the planet and how everything we're doing impacts the environment. As business people, we cannot get away from the profit side. And so that one is an easy leg to remember. But I think sometimes the third leg is the one that gets shortchanged in these sustainability conversations, and that's people. And there's a lot of different people that are important to keep front of mind. One, the communities that you are in. Environmental justice is not just a buzzword. It is something that is front line for many manufacturers, and that will only continue to grow. And so focusing on the people as it relates to the communities you are in is absolutely foundational in your leadership now, and developing and strengthening those relationships in a meaningful way. The second group of people are the employees who execute. It's so important that your employees buy in and understand what you're doing and why you're doing it and how they are critical to being a part of the sustainability solutions that you're working towards. And then the third group of people are the generations to come, and really understanding how important sustainability is to young people today, to your workforce of tomorrow, and to the worlds that we all are going to leave for those who come behind us. So I think those three things, the opportunity to lead now, the fact that while we're in different places, there's an opportunity for shared learnings and it doesn't have to be that intimidating. And then the third, just that we all remember to stay focused on all three legs of the sustainability stool. I'm really excited to hear more of the different thoughts and ideas shared today. Happy to take any questions either now or happy to have my information shared if folks want to follow up later. But thank you again for letting me get to be a part of this conversation.
Thank you so much, Rachel. That's really interesting, especially hearing from stories that you received from visiting smaller members and realizing the work that they're already doing should be measured and counted towards the efforts that we're focusing on today. So thank you for that. At the moment, we do not have any questions, but as has been mentioned before, please feel free if you think of anything to still submit them, and I'd be happy to follow up with Rachel after the event. So thank you so much again. And now I'm going to turn this over to Mary Roten of Ford, who can tell us what the sustainability journey has been like for that motor vehicle company.
Good morning, and thank you for the opportunity to speak with you all today. My name is Mary Roten, and I lead Ford's Global Sustainability and ESG program. I think some of the comments that I'm going to share today are just building upon some of Rachel's really good comments. And I'd like to comment on her feedback about the importance of publishing a sustainability report. It's so important. We've been publishing a sustainability report for 22 years now. And earlier this year, we published our first integrated sustainability and financial report. So we've combined our shareholder report that talks about all of our financials as well as our sustainability information. And it was received very well by shareholders. Our sustainability report is, we look at it as a way to communicate to our stakeholders what we're working on, but also we understand that integrated or sustainability reports are becoming a regulatory requirement in some markets around the world, especially over in Europe and here in the States with the SEC looking at mandating some requirements. Let me jump back to Ford now. We're working really hard every day to address what we consider to be one of the largest issues our industry and the world faces, which is climate change. And in my role, I work with teams across the business to help set the sustainability strategy and bring our goals to life. And it's fueled by our company purpose to help build a better world. And under that umbrella, we've established 10 sustainability aspirational goals for our company. We have defined sustainability to be very broad, to encompass both the people and the planet. Today, I'm only going to focus on one of our aspirational goals. That is our goal to become carbon neutral no later than 2050 through our vehicles, our facilities, and our suppliers. In fact, I'm asked this question quite often. How did you guys set this goal? And I'm here today to share with you how we set that goal across our vehicles, facilities, and suppliers. The first thing is it started with data. We pulled together our data from all of the categories that we're currently reporting on right now. And we found that those three categories equate for well over 95% of our global CO2 footprint. And now I'm going to share with you the specific actions we're taking to reduce our CO2 footprint in those three categories. I'll start with the vehicles. We found that our vehicles equate for well over 75% of our global CO2 footprint. So we started rolling up the sleeves and working really hard to reduce our CO2, to reduce the vehicle footprint, the CO2 footprint of our vehicles. We've made a lot of announcements. We're investing billions of dollars, well over $30 billion by 2025 to electrify not only our vehicles, but our services. And then we've made some other commitments. We've committed that 40% of our global vehicle volume is going to be all electric by 2030, with up to 50% all electric in the US by 2030. And also going a step further at the COP events, COP26 that happened last month, we signed up to the Route Zero pledge to aspirationally work toward 100% zero emission cars and vans globally by 2040. That's a huge statement. Let me repeat that. 100% zero emission vehicles globally by 2040 and in major markets by 2035. And while we think it's important not just to set these aspirational goals, we think it's important to set interim science-based targets. We've worked with the Science-Based Target Initiative, and we have approved science-based targets for our vehicles, and we're working really hard to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions from our vehicles by 50% per vehicle by 2035 from a 2019 baseline. And for those of you that are familiar in this space, this is consistent with a well below 2-degree target. And it's also a well-to-wheel target, which means that the energy that's used to propel our vehicles is part of our aspirational goal. And we're working really hard to ensure that the energy, the grid, is cleaned up. Also for our vehicles, we're electrifying our most iconic nameplates. I'm sure you've heard of the Mustang Mach-E, which is on the road. In fact, I live right outside of Ann Arbor and I see them all over the road in Ann Arbor, and it's exciting to see. We're also electrifying our most iconic F-150, the F-150 Lightning, as well as the E-Transit is coming out next year. In addition to thinking about our products, we're also developing new partnerships, such as our partnership with Redwood Materials to create a battery recycling program that will reuse over 95% of the battery's materials in order to preserve the planet's natural resources. We recognize that there's only so many natural resources on the planet, and by using battery recycling programs, we're able to address that. Now let me move to our manufacturing facilities. We're really surprised at the data when it showed that manufacturing facilities represented 3% of our global CO2 footprint. And our manufacturing facilities we have an amazing environmental quality office that has been working well over the past decade or so to reduce to improve the efficiency and conservation at our facilities. These efforts have resulted in over 40% reduction in our carbon footprint. We're now looking to the future to achieve carbon neutrality at our facilities by 2050, as I mentioned, as well as using 100% local renewable electricity in all manufacturing globally by 2035. Similar to our vehicles, we've also set science-based targets for our manufacturing facilities for Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions, where we're reducing our CO2 footprint by 76% by 2035 from a 2017 baseline. That's also aligned with a 1.5-degree pathway. So I always think it's good to talk about where we're going in the future and then talk about things that we're actually doing today, because the future 2035 sometimes seems to be a little way far off. Earlier this year in September, we announced our Blue City Oval in Tennessee and Kentucky, which will house 3 new battery plants, as well as the next generation EV facility, creating well over 11,000 new US jobs. I'm really excited to say that these facilities will be our first greenfield carbon neutral facilities. Very exciting. All right, our last pillar that I want to talk about today are our suppliers. And our suppliers represent 17% of our global CO2 footprint. And how we view our suppliers, we view them as extension of our company and expect them to adopt similar expectations as us. That's why earlier this year, we announced our supplier code of conduct, which outlined expectations for people on the planet to protect and respect human rights, protecting the environment, responsibly source raw materials, and maintain responsible business practices. Within this code, we launched our expectations for suppliers to report their Scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions, as well as water data to Ford. And we're asking our suppliers to establish science-based greenhouse gas targets, along with action plans and transparent reporting mechanisms. And we have an amazing supply chain sustainability team at Ford and they're actively working with our suppliers to help them set the targets and help them reduce their CO2 footprint, which in turn helps us to reduce our CO2 footprint. In fact, we kicked off a program back in 2014 called the Partnership for a Cleaner Environment program, where we're taking all the best practices that we've implemented in our manufacturing facilities, and we're sharing them with our suppliers, and we're asking them to implement the best ofs in their facilities, and also to share the best ofs with their suppliers. That way we can get a cascading effect and start reducing our collective CO2 footprint. I also want to mention sustainable financing. Rachel talked about climate equity and climate justice, and I just want to touch base on that just a little bit. In November, we launched our first sustainable financing framework that allows us to cover our ESG debt issuance at both the company level, so the Ford Motor Company, as well as the Ford credit level. After we launched that, we also launched our $2.5 billion green bond. And in September, we tied $15.5 billion. It's our $15.5 billion revolver to ESG metrics. We're also working to make zero emissions more affordable by offering equitable and non-discriminatory financing products that serve underserved borrowers. We're expanding our supplier diversity network and creating opportunities for diverse suppliers across minority, women, veteran, and disability-owned businesses. Our Ford Lend a Hand program offers up to 6 months of payment relief for eligible new car customers in the US, and that was in response to the US pandemic. Let me just wrap up by saying that at Ford, the value of our business is rooted in our purpose to help build a better world. We want to lead the electrification revolution because it's good for customers, good for business, and good for the planet. Thank you, and I look forward to answering whatever questions that you might have for me.
Thank you so much. We did receive one question. Some automotive OEMs require suppliers to be certified to the ISO 14001 environmental management standard, which is additional effort and cost to smaller manufacturers. Is Ford okay with directional compliance with evidence, or does a Ford supply chain supplier have to have certification to ISO 14001?
Yeah, that's a great question. ISO 14001 is a requirement at our production manufacturing facilities. I'm not sure if the person asking the question is for our direct or indirect spend, but if you want to go ahead and send me an email afterwards, I can definitely put you in touch with the team at Ford, our supplier technical assistance team that is managing that right now, and we can get that direct question answer specific for you as a company and you as a supplier.
Thank you. I will help that question follow up with you.
Okay, that sounds great. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. And now I'm going to turn this over to Susan to tell you about some of the research and practical ways she sees manufacturers can change their current practices to build a greener and more sustainable economy. Welcome, Susan.
Good morning, everyone. Slides, please. Thank you. Okay, next slide. So I'm a program manager for carbon capture and utilization at the University of Michigan, Global CO2 Initiative. I do come from industry. I was 15 years at Ford working on new technology commercialization. So wanted to give you an introduction to what carbon capture and utilization, which we call CCU, or carbon capture and sequestration or storage, CCS, are. Basically, this is a process where you capture the emissions from a point source. If you have a factory, it can be your smokestack, or also from the air. We call that direct air capture. And you capture those emissions and then you do something with them. You can turn them into useful products. So this is an example of a cement factory here in Michigan. We did a study over the summer where we looked at what products they they could make with 1 million tons of CO2. This is the St. Mary's concrete facility. We identified for that facility over 20 manufacturing feedstocks could be made from their waste CO2 that could be utilized in at least 5 million tons of feedstock products, including concrete, carbonated aggregates. So those are things like rocks for concrete or asphalt, tires, methanol, plastics we could not even assess because the market is kind of hard to get your arms around, but lots of things you can do with captured CO2 in terms of placing it into products or putting it underground. Not all areas of the country are good for this, but Michigan is. We have saline aquifers in this part of the state with tremendous capacity for permanent storage of CO2. Next slide, please. The Global CO2 Initiative did a study on the global markets for CO2 back in 2016. A new version will be coming out in 2022, but basically we seek to ask the question, what can you make with captured carbon and how big of a market is it? And so what we saw at that time is that construction materials are definitely the largest market in terms of your ability to stuff CO2 into products for permanent sequestration, with a large dollar opportunity as well. And there are a couple of manufacturers on the market with carbon sequestered concretes and more in the aggregate side and more coming every day. The way to think about that is that's permanent sequestration of CO2 in this case. There's also circular sequestration in fuels and chemicals, and those are the next largest market. And that's where we think of it in terms of using the same carbon molecule over and over again, where you're capturing it from the smokestack or vacuuming it out of the air, rather than taking it from fossil sources. What we see is that incumbent drop-in replacement products, wherever possible, are the best. What we mean is the best, it's just the easiest. The consumer doesn't necessarily have to make a decision or even know where the CO2 came from. I mean, carbon isn't everything, of course. And we get excited about working with manufacturers, existing manufacturers, because you already have the manufacturing and the sales and the distribution network for products. And so if we're going to solve the problem of climate change, working with the incumbent players, we think is the primary strategy. There's also a place for startups, but we're already seeing that startups in this space are just simply getting gobbled up by larger manufacturers. And we think that's likely to continue over time. Next slide, please. So addressing the challenge of climate change really creates an opportunity. And Mary touched on this a little bit from Ford, where we need to tackle in a number of areas: adaptation, which is where we just simply adjust what's happening; decarbonization, that is transitioning to electric fuel sources rather than fossil fuel sources; energy efficiency, upgrading your HVAC fans, putting in LED light bulbs, things like that; capture and storage, that's what I'm working with today; and then hit the next button for carbon capture and use on the slide, please. Oh, there we go. And that's what we see is carbon capture and utilization. We need all of these to solve climate change. There is some rhetoric out there that, offsets are what we need, or, renewables alone. No, we need all of these. We need all of the above to get the job done. One of the things that's interesting about what we do, none of us here are old enough to remember the great horse manure crisis of 1894, but at that time, large cities were experiencing up to 3 feet of manure in city centers, and it was projected to reach 9 feet in 50 years. We're in the same mess with CO2, basically, except that it's colorless, it's odorless, we don't see it. But we've put 1.2 trillion tons of CO2 in the atmosphere since the Industrial Revolution, and we're going to have to change that. Next slide, please. So tomorrow's carbon sources, if you could advance through all of the activation. In terms of carbon, it can come from 4 places. There's one more. There's fossil carbon, which is what we need to move away from. There's plant carbon, recycled carbon, think of recycled plastics. And then the last one, if you hit the advance, is gaseous or atmospheric carbon. And there's really 2 drivers behind this. One, of course, is climate change, and that's what's getting all the press and the ink right now. That's where all the buzz is about. But there's another factor that I'm not really hearing people talk about as much. My geologists friends, researcher friends, tell me that we're going to run out of fossil energy soon. BP publishes a big report annually on, what are the reserves. And right now we've got, at the end of last year, we've got about 140 years of coal. We have 50 years of gas and 50 years of oil. And so thinking in terms of industrial scale and capital assets and how much time is needed to transition those assets to new sources of energy and new sources of carbon for products, which primarily comes from fossil sources today, we really do need to get going. Humanity is using the liquid forms of carbon at orders of magnitude higher than the Earth can make them. Earth is still making these, but we're just not enough. So next slide, please. So now is a great time for us as a society to be looking at this. So when we look at what can you make from captured CO2, this is a slide from 2016. Again, we're updating this. We'll have a new release in the spring, but these are an example, a different example of how you slice and dice the products you can make from captured CO2 and where they were at that time. Since that study, we're seeing startups who are making real inroads into the marketplace. So I think in terms of LanzaTech, for example, they're taking captured CO2 and turning it into ethanol. They just announced a clothing partnership with Zara. Solidia is making curing CO2 with curing concrete with CO2 instead of water. They're making pavers and bricks for the construction market. 12 is making eyeglass lenses, ingredients for Tide, car parts. So this is possible. Next slide, please. So there's a good reason then to utilize CO2 in useful products. Carbon capture and utilization and also carbon capture and sequestration do have cost critics for good reason. It can be much more expensive. However, there are lots of companies starting to figure it out, and universities like us and many others who are also working on the problem. If you're not aware of it, there's something called the 45Q tax code that will give you, it's a credit from the IRS that will give you up to $50 a ton for capturing and either sticking underground or utilizing your CO2 in products. So this is a very important thing to be aware of. And right now there's lots of discussions going on to expand that opportunity. Next slide, please. So there are a lot of sources in CO2. Please advance the actives for me. There are, you can't just think in terms of, okay, I have CO2, it makes sense to capture and use it. You need to consider what is the energy that is propelling the capture of that CO2? Is it fossil-based? Is it renewables? What kind of post-capture process of that CO2 is required? Can I use the raw flue gas in my utilized products? Do I need to run it through a processing facility? Does it need to be 95% pure? Is it 100% pure? Do I need to move it around? If so, by how? Is it by truck? Is it going to be a pipeline? In our area, we don't have pipelines yet. The state of Michigan is thinking about that. What are the impacts on land use? And then, of course, cost. So next slide, please. And then which technologies are best? What we see is that you really need to study that carefully. We looked, for example, at 99 ways to make carbon sequestered concrete, and over half of them were worse than regular concrete. There are, if you're just getting started in this, there are lots of tools available. We have them. An CCUS site is available with tools and calculators. There are other calculators that might be available specifically to your industry. Next slide, please. So would you use CO2 products in moving forward through the advances? We did a study on this a couple years ago. This was just a simple early study. This is very early days in this space. We surveyed 2,400 people, and consumers were 69% of them said, yeah, I'd use a carbon capture and utilize product. We looked at beverages, plastic containers, furniture, and shatterproof glass. Most of them, as you can see, were, yeah, I would probably use that. So that's good news. You know, they were more excited about plastic beverage containers than they were beer made from captured CO2. And that makes sense if you think about it. So, but again, moving to the next slide, products such as concrete or steel don't necessarily need consumer buy-in. It'll be important to ESG goals and also attracting young talent to work for your company in the future, but not necessarily consumer visible. So this is how we see the carbon capture and utilization implementation ecosystem. It's complex. There's the processes, the products, and then the system design framework, including social justice, consumer acceptance, policy, etc. Last slide, please. So if you are new to this space, a place to start would be to think in terms of getting an overall carbon neutrality plan or carbon plan together for your business. Mary spoke in terms of having data. If you already know where the CO2 is in your business, in your supply chain, then think about what you can do to eliminate it, use it, store it, or offset it. And so with that, I'm going to hand over to Carolyn Leafin from MMA, and she's going to give you some insight on what's on the horizon in state and federal sustainability policy, and then lead a Q&A.
Thank you so much. Yeah, so as everyone knows, I'm Caroline Leafin, MMA's Director of Environmental and Regulatory Policy. Again, I want to encourage you to put your questions into the Q&A function for Zoom, and I will get to those questions in a moment. And also, please let me say how much we welcome and appreciate this chance to partner with the Nature Conservancy to find ways for our manufacturers to deal with the coming pressures to address emissions from regulations, customers' demands, and a younger labor force more committed to sustainability. I also want to thank Madhu, Rachel, Mary, and Susan for being with us today. As you know, Rachel and Mary had to drop off for other commitments, but Madhu, Susan, and I will be glad to answer your questions in just a moment. And now I will provide a brief update on work happening at the state level related to environmental policy. So first, as some of you may be aware, Governor Whitmer created the Council on Climate Solutions in 2020 as an advisory board in the Department of Environment, Great Lakes and Energy's Office of Climate and Energy. The council was charged with formulating and overseeing the implementation of the My Healthy Climate Plan, which will guide the state in reducing greenhouse gas emissions and transitioning toward economy-wide carbon neutrality by 2050. The work is required to include identifying and recommending opportunities for the development and effective implementation of emissions reduction strategies and identifying solutions to resolve impact disparities across Michigan and recommending target solutions for communities disproportionately impacted by the changing climate. The council formed 5 advisory work groups to cover building and housing, energy intensive industries, energy production, transmission, distribution, and storage, natural working lands and forest products, and transportation and mobility. Each work group has already submitted recommendations that are will either be adopted, rejected, or modified by the council as a whole. So the council met as recently as yesterday to discuss the draft outline of their My Healthy Michigan plan. And so from there, a draft version of the plan will be completed in mid to late January. It will go out for public comment and will be finalized within hopefully the next 3 months, so early 2022. Somewhat related is Governor Whitmer named Corey Connolly as a new advisor to the aforementioned Office of Climate and Energy on December 3rd. Connolly most recently served as the vice president of the Michigan Energy Innovation Business Council and also founded the Michigan Clean Energy Leaders Project. He will lead Michigan's response to climate change through coordination across state departments and agencies and provide recommendations, guidance, and assistance on climate change mitigation, adaptation, and resiliency strategies. And that will include formulating and overseeing implementation of the My Healthy Climate Plan. And then finally, as our previous panelists have mentioned throughout their presentations, Eagle also has an Office of Environmental Justice, Public Advocate, although this work does span the entire department and also other agencies. But that office in particular is tasked with serving as an external and internal voice to ensure environmental justice throughout the state. The office establishes and implements processes and reporting of environmental justice complaints and assists with resolution of issues. The environmental justice public advocate, Regina Strong, is in charge with leading the state's interagency environmental justice response team. So as everyone is aware, probably, but officially the EPA defines environmental justice as the fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all people, regardless of race, color, meaningful involvement of all people, regardless of race, color, national origin, or income with respect to the development, implementation, and enforcement of environmental laws, regulations, and policies. So toward that end, Eagle is developing an environmental justice screening and mapping tool to review multiple environmental, public health, and socioeconomic factors that communities with environmental justice concerns face. There have been presentations given by Eagle on this tool. However, it hasn't been made public yet. However, the presentations have covered that the tool will be used to inform decisions, allocate resources, and address community-specific issues and or concerns. Considerations would include traffic density, asthma rates, cardiovascular disease, low birth rate, blood lead levels, life expectancy, and other census data. And a draft version of the tool is expected to be made available to the public shortly, with the goal of finalization at some point in 2022. But meanwhile, something that MMA and some of its members have been experiencing is that environmental considerations are currently being incorporated into some of the current Eagle decision-making progress, including issuing and renewing permits. So recently we've experienced Eagle's Air Division issuing a minor source air permit in accordance with federal and state law. However, the permit includes a number of site-specific conditions beyond what is normally included in permits for similar facilities based on its intended location. So that's a bit of a preview of what may be to come, but I have been working with Eagle and specifically their air quality division to say that MMA plans on and definitely wants to work with Eagle and AQD in order to develop either guidance or some sort of way to expect how environmental justice issues can be incorporated into decisions and permit processes in the future so that they can be anticipated. And that they have been receptive, although we have no timeline yet for the beginning of that work. Again, I hope that that will be at some point in 2022. Somewhat, well, actually completely related to the air source permit that I had just mentioned, Eagle had also submitted a letter to EPA requesting assistance with the development of incorporation of environmental issues into their work. They specifically asked for conducting a review of the permit, enhancing Eagle's ability to evaluate air toxics concerns through either both resources and technical assistance, and also asked for EPA to provide additional clarity to the states on implementing federal standards in environmental justice communities. One of the suggestions was that there be a national summit on the issue. To my knowledge, I haven't seen a response to that, but it was not sent too long ago. I believe it was about a month. So again, all of these issues, MMA has been working with AQD in our interest in coordinating those efforts. Also, I have reached out and am coordinating with MEDC Brownfield Redevelopment and interested in kind of working through 2022 on those two agencies and how they coordinate on incorporation of environmental justice issues, and also incentivizing companies to be involved with brownfield redevelopment. So with that, please take time to answer the poll that should be popping up shortly. Let's see here. We'd like to be of assistance to you and see how we can address and offer your interests and concerns in the coming sessions. Also, thank you to Madhu. She will be helping us with more information in a moment on the coming sessions. We have not received any questions at the moment, but I do want to share my email address in case you think of any later, and I'd be happy to follow up with you. I can be reached at liethen@mimfg.org. Please feel free to email me at any time if you have any questions or suggestions for the coming webinars. There are 3 additional ones to be planned. And with that, I will turn it over to Madhu.
Thank you, Caroline. I hope, and thank you for all of you who've been participating this past hour. I hope that we gave you some insight into what's coming up and some various, whetted your appetite to think about this issue of sustainability in the future. As noted before we started, the webinar was recorded, so you can go back and re-listen or share this with anyone that you'd like to share it with. Just drop us an email and we can send you a link. I want to also, again, show my appreciation for the Michigan Manufacturers Association for partnering with us on this topic. We hope that you'll join us in the future for a couple more sessions. As Caroline mentioned, the Michigan Climate Solutions Council will be putting out a draft report, and at our next session in January, we will have the director of EGLE join us to talk about climate and sustainability issues, as well as a representative from on federal policy, Jason Albatron from the Nature Conservancy, will talk about the many federal legislative proposals and laws that have been enacted recently that affect sustainability and potential tax credits, as Susan also mentioned. Our February seminar will include peers from Michigan, those companies that have actually made some initial progress on their emission reductions, and it'll give you a chance to really get into the nitty-gritty of sustainability practices. And finally, we hope that we'll end our series with some very down-to-earth resources that you can use in your companies as you go on this journey yourself. So please register for the upcoming seminars. You can go to the events page on the MMA website and register there. Thank you again for participating, and we hope to see you in January. Thanks.
Yes, we will be sharing slides of the presentation with participants, and also, as Madhu said, it will be recorded and shared as well.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.